I'm sorry, for an hour, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining AAF Omaha for today's professional development webinar. First, I'm David Lamb, president of AAF Omaha. I would like to acknowledge our friends, our colleagues, our community, and our country, especially those who have been affected by racism in our country. We stand with you, and Black Lives Matter. At the end of the presentation, we will open for Q&A. Feel free to use the comment function with your questions during today's presentation, and we'll have Yeosh answer your questions at the end of the program. AAF is focused on how we can best support our members and the Omaha advertising community during this pandemic. We consider our organization essential to our advertising, marketing, and communication professionals. We continue to develop relevant content, virtual programming, and valuable tools to support our community. AAF Omaha's mission, with more than 325 professional and student members, is to be the unifying voice for advertising in the Omaha Council Bluffs metro area. We offer an organization to educate, inspire, and bring an inclusive sense of community to the advertising professionals of Omaha so that we and future generations can continue to do the work we love. Our webinar keynote today is Yeosh Bendayan from Push Button Creative Audio in Gainesville, Florida. Yeosh will give his ideas, tips, and tricks for developing concepts and pitching your podcast ideas to your clients. He'll break down the process developed by his company, Push Button Creative Audio, and share promotional audio branding and measurement tools to help you along the way. Yeosh is a University of Florida alum and founder and partner at Push Button Creative Audio, a quirky Orlando-based company that develops audio brands for regional and national advertisers. Push Button's clients include Pyrex, Buca de Beppo, Budget Blinds, Simple Mobile, Lampkin Golf Grips, First Watch, ID Strong Hunt, and over 40 credit unions nationwide. Check out pushbuttonproductions.com. Yeosh is also the vice chair of National American Advertising Federation Council of Governors, as well as a past governor of the 4th District of the American Advertising Federation. Welcome.
Thanks. And I already have to correct a few things on that bio that so we're Orlando based. I think you mentioned Gainesville at the beginning. We started in Gainesville, and I am no longer the vice chair. I'm now the chair of the Council of Governors. I'm actually about to be the outgoing chair. So a lot has changed, and I guess I need to send more updated bios. So I apologize for that. But thank you guys for inviting me on today. I've never been to Omaha myself, but I hold out hope that one day you guys will invite me back and I'll be able to go in person. That would be excellent. So I'm sure I'm missing out on some great local stuff. I have spent a little bit of time in Nebraska. I had clients in a credit union in Nebraska, and I'm trying to remember what city they were. Is Lenexa? Does that sound right? Is that a town? Am I making that up?
Lexington?
No, they were in, it'll come back to me. It's been a few years. We really only had one consistent Nebraska client for a while, and then it was a credit union there in town. Anyway, so my name is Yeosh, like David said. I am in Orlando right now. The weather's kind of great. It's kind of fantastic. We had a rocket launch this weekend. That was really exciting. Hopefully you guys watched that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about branded podcasts. I've shared my screen here with you. I'm going to go into full presentation mode. There is a chat box that I understand is being monitored. And for sure, if you want to interrupt me at any time during this presentation, ask me a question. It's a small enough group. I do not mind that at all. If there's something that you want a little bit of clarity on, I'm happy to provide it. Let's get into, let me minimize some boxes here. What the deal is with podcasts. So here's something really interesting that's been happening with digital platforms, right? We take something that's old, we dress it up as something digital, and then suddenly it becomes the thing that every hipster wants to be a part of. And essentially, we have known about the power of audio as a storytelling medium for 100 years, right? And probably even longer than that. Radio has been probably the biggest, most influential storytelling medium through the early part of the last century. And, you know, as families gathered to hear broadcasts like War of the Worlds, you know, these are things that have high cultural significance and played a big role in our history. So very similar to what happened at the early part of the 2000s, where print journalism was declared dead, but really what happened was it moved online in the form of blogs and online content. We're seeing a very similar trajectory for podcasts. And even if you look at like what YouTube has done for television, right, in a certain regard, YouTube has taken a lot of the content that was made for TV, and really what it is doing is it's more democratizing the people's ability to create content. So it used to be that you had to have a radio station, right? If you wanted to be a journalist, you had to have you had to go to a journalism school, you had to study, you had to go work at a newspaper, right? So you had to have huge distribution. That was the only way you could do it. Same with television news, same with radio. If you wanted to be a player, you had to have quite a bit of money in order to make that happen. And now we've taken that and we've put it into the power, we've put the power into the hands of the masses, and it gives everybody an opportunity to have a voice on the platform, regardless of the resources that you have available at the time. So it really stands to reason that it makes sense, and honestly can't believe it took as long as it did for podcasts to become a thing. All along, though, we have known that this was going to happen. I think anybody involved in audio, anybody involved in radio, for the last 20 years has kind of just been waiting for the traction of podcasts to finally take off. And that trajectory, for all intents and purposes, started in about 2013 is when we started to see a significant uptake. And the last 7 years has been slowly building momentum. So we'll talk about what it's doing in terms of demographic shifts into podcasts, why people are listening and how they're listening in just a few minutes. But first, just want to introduce my company. We're Push Button Creative Audio, as David said. Here's 3 things you need to know about me and why I'm talking to you today. I'm a partner at Push Button Creative Audio. I've been doing this for 20 years. Push Button's been around for 15. We are audio producers, mainly started out doing radio productions. Then we eventually got into music development a few years after we started. And so we're a full custom music production house. And then about 3 years ago, got in earnest involved into the development of podcasts. And very specifically, we work with brands. So we don't develop podcasts for like a comedian who wants to come in and do a podcast. Like that's not our MO. Our MO is really working with brands to get them into the branded podcast space in a way that is natural, organic, and serves the purpose of what they're trying to do. And of course, we've entered a million Addy Awards and Creativity International Awards and Radio Mercury Awards. So we've got all that, which is super cool. Some of our clients, but that's great. Let's talk about audio first platforms. So for the last few years, we've seen a pretty sharp increase in platforms that are engaging with us on an audio only method, right? So you've got home listening devices like Google Home and Alexa. We're used to giving our phones audio commands, right? So like we're becoming more accustomed to environments where audio is the primary sense medium that we're using in order to communicate. And so part of that obviously leads into what we're talking about today, which is 2020 being the year of podcasting. Now, this presentation was put together earlier this year. And so one of the things I like to do with Google is I like to see how predictive Google is. So at the beginning of the year, and I've done this a couple of years now, I will ask Google, what will this year be known for? So the question was, what will 2020 be known for? And so Google spits out a bunch of things. And then as the year goes on and I give this presentation more and more, it's kind of funny to see how wrong Google can be. So I'll tell you, it didn't say anything about a pandemic. I will say that for sure. So according to Google, 2020 is going to be the year of the rebrand, which of course every year sees some pretty great rebrands. So I don't know how specific that could be. 2020 was to be the year of the consenticorn. And if anybody can tell me what a consenticorn is, I will send you a box of muffins. But odds are you are not familiar with the term, which means a hall monitor in social settings. So it's basically a person at a club or at a bar that is monitoring and policing to make sure adequate consent is being granted to whatever's happening. 2020 is the year of the Earth Pig, which is just factual and gives me an excuse to use this GIF, which is all I really wanted. According to Google, 2020 would be the year of the layered pixie, and it couldn't be more wrong. It has so far been the year of the mullet, which I myself tried and immediately shaved off. So 2020, though, has been called the year of podcasting, and we have some data to back this up. So if we talk about what consumers are doing, the average American consumer is listening to about 52 minutes, so almost an hour of audio per day on mobile devices. And this can be anything from audiobooks to podcasts to music streaming services, right? But the habit is there, the habit of listening to long form content through mobile devices has definitely increased dramatically in the last few years. We've seen about a 300% increase in year over year ad spends on podcasts. And we'll talk a little bit later on in the presentation about advertising and its role in creating and its role in helping to create this podcast space. But the thing to note here is that advertising has basically caught up to the trend. And when you see increases like this in advertising, this has not happened up until recently. When you see things like this, you kind of understand that the money is flowing there, right? The ears are there, the listeners are there, and advertising is now catching up to that because that's usually how it works. We've seen an over 1,500% increase in podcast listenership since 2013 to 2019. Now, I will caution this, all the data represented in this presentation today is as of the end of 2019. 2020 data is a little bit sparse right now. I like to gather data towards the end of the year just because it gives you a better picture. And obviously this year with everybody being at home more and all the things that are going on, it's going to be interesting to see how all of these shifts change. In my opinion, it will actually, it will lean more into this. I think we will see a more dramatic shift into some of these things as people have more time to consume different sorts of audio. If we look at podcast listenership by age and across demographics, there's a really interesting shift happened, but it follows a lot of what happened with social media and YouTube over the course of the last 20 years, right? So what we saw in 2005 with social media was a large spike in 18 to 24, right? That's the years that I was in college. Early adopters tend to be that younger generation. Used it intensely. We aged into that 25 to 34 crowd. And then suddenly it became mainstream, right? And then grandma's on Facebook. And we're seeing a very similar trajectory and shift here. So a few years ago, podcast listenership was largely defined by that 18 to 24 group. As that group has gotten a little bit older, we now see the largest demographic is in that 25 to 34 group. And the largest growth is in the 45 plus currently, right? So what we see is a lot of 45 plus year olds are getting into the podcast space, and that is to be expected. And as that demographic continues to listen more, that's where the buying power is. So we're going to start to see more money spent on it, more influence developed through podcasting and podcast mediums. If we look at things by gender, of course, fairly even split. So there's no real indication that it's, men versus women. It's about 50-50. And in terms of ad revenue generated by podcasts, you can see over the past 5 years, a substantial uptick in the amount of money being spent. And late last year crossed the $500 million mark in terms of ad revenue. The interesting thing about podcasts ad revenue is it's difficult. I get some people will ask me like, hey, I want to place media in a podcast. How do I go about it? And the funny thing is it's a little Wild West-ish, a little Wild Westy in terms of cost. You call a local podcast and say you want to advertise, one guy might do it for, $1 million and another gal might ask you for a ham sandwich. I don't know. They're just kind of making it up as they go along because there's not really quantifiable metrics to determine, CPMs are one way you can go about it, but it's not quite the same as broadcast. So there's still a little bit of not being super sure how to price things, particularly when you're dealing with, people who are producing content on a small scale, right? Or whether they're producing it from home, or maybe they're doing this as a hobby. They're not really sure how to quantify that spend. Where are people listening to podcasts is a really interesting question. I think if you would have asked me this 2 or 3 years ago, before we really got involved in earnest since developing podcasts, I would have assumed that the majority of people were listening to podcasts on their way to work, during a commute, or possibly at the gym. But the reality of the situation is that the majority of people are listening at home. And it's kind of fascinating, but if you think about it, podcasting is one of those things that you can do that really only involves sound, right? So you're not tethered to your phone and you're not attached to your TV visually. So you can cook, you can do laundry, you can, there's a million other things that you can do. And I think what's happening, in my opinion, is there's a shift away from people who used to leave maybe the TV on for long periods of time to just have noise in the home. We're seeing a shift to people who are looking for more of that audio content, right? So they're going more to that podcast platform to fill some of those needs, which is really a fascinating thing. There are over 800,000 active podcasts currently. There was a dramatic increase in the amount of podcasts created last year alone. Hundreds of thousands, and I believe there's a stat coming up for that here in just a few minutes. More than half of the US has listened to a podcast at this point, and of those listening, about 1 in 5 are active monthly listeners to podcasts. That was in 2018. So about 20% of Americans were active monthly consumers of podcasts. About 27% increase of podcast creation was seen last year alone. If you look at the overall numbers though, right, if you compare 800,000 active podcasts currently with, say, the number of active YouTube channels, or the number of, blogs in the blogosphere, if you consider those things, 800,000 sounds like a lot. There are tens of millions of YouTube channels and active blogs. And so there's room for a lot of content creation in this space. And particularly if you've gone down the rabbit hole of listening to podcasts, like just kind of going and experimenting and trying to see what you might like, you realize quickly there is a lot of hot garbage being produced, mainly because it's not well researched, it's not well produced, or the hosting is just lacking. There's a lot of really easy pitfalls, and I think a lot of people misunderstand the medium and how to use it to tell story, and they also don't understand how complex it is to put together really great content. The average podcast listener is consuming about 6.5 hours a week of content. And on average, they're having 6 subscriptions and listening to about 7 episodes a week. Subscriptions versus downloads, 2 different facts that are important to get right. Subscriptions, similar to YouTube, if you go and you find a podcast that you really like, you can subscribe to it. That means you are now one of their subscribers. But the total number of listeners equates to their downloads. So if you're a subscriber and you don't go back and listen to more episodes, that really doesn't mean much in the long run in terms of this podcast trying to grow an audience, right? A large number of subscribers is a good indicator that there's a lot of views or listens, but it's not always that way. So what is a brand podcast? A brand podcast is essentially taking content that's being created for a mass audience and attaching a brand to it, right? So in this case, and in cases of many branded podcasts, what it is a brand producing content on behalf of an audience, right? It's a brand saying like, hey, we really believe in this, or we think that this audience is looking for this content. And instead of waiting for somebody else to create that content and attaching our brand to it through commercial promotion, we're going to go ahead as the brand and create the content on behalf of our audience and put it out there and attach our brand to it that way. So when you look at it through that lens, it sort of shifts what a branded podcast means for a lot of people. I believe that a lot of people look at the branded podcast space as an opportunity to sell more product or as an opportunity to explain something. And that's not really what podcasts do. Podcasts live in the PR channel. They are tools for storytelling. They are tools for communicating a message, but they're not great tools for selling. So if your perspective is, I've got a company that makes fishing reels, and I'm going to put together a podcast all about fishing reels, be prepared to not have a lot of listeners, honestly. So it's all about creating that content that audience is looking for. So why would you want to do a branded podcast? Well, of course, it helps with brand engagement, right? You're attaching your brand to something that your audience is looking for, and that's always beneficial. It increases your brand awareness because you have content control, and you can certainly, use that to your advantage. It elevates the brand because you are now producing content that positions you as an industry expert. You're increasing consumer product knowledge occasionally. And of course, you're establishing trust between your audience, your consumers, and your brand, and you're making your PR and social teams happy. And it's very important to mention the PR and social teams because they are highly involved in this process, or they should be. So podcasts require active listening, and they're great tools for primary and secondary research, right? Because people, and as you'll see, Google algorithm shifts over the next few years are going to work increasingly more to the benefit of podcast content. So soon, Google will begin crawling the podcast content, right? So they're going to take the audio content, convert it to text or whatever Google does, and they are going to be able to crawl that so that when you search for content, it's going to bring up podcasts as part of their results. So this is important if you rely heavily on Google, as my company does, to help generate sales or leads or whatever. So these are important things to know, specifically if you're working with your digital team on these sorts of things. So I want to give you guys a few examples of some successful branded podcasts that I recommend you listen to. After this, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of content development and production and stuff like that. So, but I want to give you guys a couple of little things that you can take a look at. The first one is The Message by GE. And GE, I mean, what do? A few of us might have some refrigerators, dishwashers. By and large, their skill set is in large scale mechanical development, right? They're making wind turbines and they're producing jet engines, and it's things that you and I are probably never going to buy casually. So when GE looks at a podcast, right, and they're trying to do whatever it is they're trying to do, increase consumer sentiment for their brand, or just get people's general attention, the knee-jerk reaction is probably like, well, let's make a podcast about all our product lines. But instead, what GE did was create a science fiction podcast. And in this podcast, they had scientists working to decode alien messages using real GE technology, which is kind of cool if you think about it. I mean, they found a way to tie in what their company does into something that the general population would have an interest in, right? It's great. It's storytelling, and it's a really clever way to weave a brand into a podcast. The second one is The Sauce by McDonald's. For those Rick and Morty fans in the room, you're familiar with McDonald's Szechuan sauce and the serious PR problem that was created for McDonald's by the Rick and Morty episode about it. So long story short, McDonald's had a PR issue related to a sauce. And instead of sort of recoiling, they decided to make a podcast about it. And it's really fascinating. It's really interesting. And they turned a negative into a positive. It's just a really cool story for you to check out. And the third one I want you to check out is Lip Stories by Sephora. I always have to slow down before I say Sephora because my knee jerk is to say Sephora, but it's Lip Stories by Sephora. And this is really interesting because it's a brand that has a very niche audience, right? And they took people who inspired their product lines and created really great stories about the people who inspire the brand. And they shared those stories with their audience. And this is a wonderful way to show an audience that you understand them, right? That you get their perspectives. You're kind of holding a mirror up to the audience, and you're providing them these great stories and cool content that they otherwise might not be getting. The audience might not otherwise be getting, and you're attaching your brand to it. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody involved. So now that we've got those three things, let's talk about what kinds of brands podcasts, a branded podcast makes sense for. There's four general kinds that we're going to talk about today. The first is a lifestyle brand, right? So niche products, personal brands, for example, even within product categories, if you look at the automotive sector, Toyota is a value brand. It's a value, it's value in that, people aren't really absorbing a lifestyle by purchasing a Toyota. They're not really talking about who they are when they purchase a Toyota, right? But if you look at Subaru, if you look at Jeep, these are lifestyle brands within the automotive category. Even within Toyota, you've got Toyota Racing Division, right? Which is a niche, it's a niche marketing of their truck lines that specifically that line is a lifestyle brand within Toyota, and people are very passionate about TRD. And so that would make sense to produce a podcast based in that vertical, specifically their TRD line. If you look at other types of brands, like brands with an educational mission. So like you heard during my bio, I work with a lot of credit unions. About a third of the business that my company does is with credit unions and financial institutions. Their reaction is always like, hey, I want to do a podcast. And I want to talk about mortgages, which is just, stab me. I don't want to talk about mortgages. So what we do with them is we encourage them to focus their educational mission in a way that's more engaging and storytelling, right? So we do that a lot of different ways. One way that we do it is through microcasts, 5 to 15 minute, so very short podcasts. And this can be storytelling about a member. This could be fictional stories. This could be, a number of different things, but we're creating educational content that's entertaining. And it's not like, let me tell you how to get a mortgage. And, oh, here's our mortgage lender to talk more about getting a mortgage. Like, we can create content that's educational and that serves the mission of the organization, that is entertaining and engaging. So that is my one cautionary tale there. Brands that take a stand on some sort of an issue. This is a great way to podcast, because if you've got a brand that people understand universally what your positions are on certain things, nobody's going to get particularly offended by the fact that you came out and said something about it, right? So if you are, Reef flip-flops and you've got a strong environmental stance and you want to do an environmental impact podcast, that is fantastic, right? That makes total sense. Your audience knows that's what you're known for. It's right in line with your mission, and that is something that you can easily pivot into. What you don't want to do is take a brand that obviously doesn't normally take political, social, or environmental things into like as part of its brand umbrella, and then suddenly, have an audience that's confused about why you're talking about these things. And finally, brands looking to connect with an audience on a more intimate level. It is that's kind of a little bit of a catch-all, but there are brands out there that are looking for a deeper connection with an audience, right? They're not comfortable being commoditized. They want to work to break that commoditization of their brand, right? So that certainly makes a lot of sense for them as well. There are 5 things that you're going to need for a great branded podcast. They are the tech, the idea, the process, the platform and promotion, and of course the metrics and the money, assuming you're trying to make money with this. So we're going to cover these 5 things here real quick. First, let's talk about the tech. Probably the first question, the question I get most often is, what do I need to start a podcast? Can I just use my computer's microphone? Well, if you're going to ask an audio engineer, audio producer, their opinion on this matter, you pretty much know the answer. And that's heck no. You definitely can't. You need to invest in a minimum level of technology in order to get stuff done. Even if you're doing stuff on a personal level, you got to consider people are listening to you in many cases with earbuds. You're in their brainstem. If you've got cracking, popping, hissing, anything like that going on in your audio, people aren't going to suffer that. I mean, they are just going to shut it off and move on. If you're representing a brand, you really need to make sure that the content is produced in a way and of a caliber and quality that is in line with that brand. So I'll give you a quick rundown of some of the basics. So your tech includes everything from your microphone, your preamp, which powers your mic, your mixer, your analog to digital conversion, which is the device that takes your signal from your microphone and puts it into your computer, and your digital audio workstation, which is a fancy way to say software, your editing software, and of course, some sort of speaker or microphones, right? So pretty short list of things. If you're doing something consumer grade and you just want it to sound pretty good, like if you're making a, I don't know, whatever, reality series, Bachelor podcast, I don't know. If you want to do that, you could probably invest 500 to 800, 900 bucks on a pretty good consumer grade setup. If you're doing something on behalf of a brand, I would recommend looking into a, sort of a mid-grade professional setup. And you're probably looking in the neighborhood of about $3,000, which is not a huge investment. If you want a multi-microphone setup, you might be talking about a little bit more, maybe 4,000, maybe 5,000, somewhere in there. It kind of just, it all depends on, there's a million ways to slice this. When we provide, since the pandemic, we have had to actually shift all of our production to virtual, which is crazy, but it's going really well. As you can see, we're actually in the middle of finishing a build out on our studio when the pandemic happened. And so we're like in this in between. So we shifted everything to these virtual kits that we're sending out. And so there are great technologies available. I'm happy to recommend, if you want recommendations on types of microphones and things, you can certainly reach out to me. I'll put my contact information in here and you guys can reach out. Happy to get you that stuff. But that's, a general pricing for what you can expect to spend on the technology component of this. This is where everybody gets caught up, the idea. What do I want to talk about? While we figure that out, let me give you a little bit of information that might help you in figuring that out, because I can't tell you what to talk about, but I can hopefully guide you in that direction. There are 6 podcast formats that I want to talk to you about today and sort of explain what the benefits and downsides are to a couple of these. So the first is going to be the monologue. Monologue format is single host talking for however long, 30 minutes to an hour. This is a very difficult format to pull off because you are relying 1,000% on the person who is speaking. And if they're not great on microphone, it's kind of a mess. And it's honestly not really even that interesting to listen to. I mean, short of being Barack Obama or Rush Limbaugh, it's very difficult to talk for a long period of time and keep people's attention. So I would probably tell you to go ahead and scratch this one right off, because monologue is almost too difficult for mere mortals to put together. The multi-host format is one that involves typically a combination of 2 people. It could have 3, and it'll involve like an interview component, right? So the great thing about this is you've got a hosting team that has a relationship with each other and has a relationship with the audience, right? So now you've got sort of like a little bit of a relationship with their host, and then you can incorporate interviews that will come, and even if that interview is really bad, it can help. The fact that you've got a hosting team with a dynamic can help offset a guest that's not maybe as interesting as you had hoped. The interview format, it tends to blend with other formats very well. Full-on interview shows are, not very, they're not very easy to make super interesting all the time, because you're putting a lot of emphasis on your guests to be interesting. So, I would say an interview component to a show is a great thing. An entire show that's based around interviews is difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult. Then we get into the roundtable conversational. So this is like a panel, right? So we're going to have a panel of people speaking on a particular topic. Interesting, can be very good. However, one thing that I will caution is that it's very difficult when you don't have a visual cue to keep voices straight in your head. So make sure as you're building panels that you're keeping in mind that people have to visualize who's speaking. So people who sound very similar can be often a little bit confusing. So just bearing in mind that that's sort of a hurdle that has to be overcome when you do panel or multiple voice podcasts. A narrative and documentary / storytelling podcast, this is where advertising lives, right? Because what we do at the core of everything that we do as advertisers is tell stories. And having a narrative, a documentary style, like, it's so beautiful, but it's so time consuming to produce. It's the most difficult of the formats to produce. This American Life does a great job, but This American Life has teams of people. So, just caution when you get into this, right? If you're going to tell these really beautiful, long-winded stories, they're amazing. However, very difficult to do. So, each of these things individually, you can look at combinations of these things. You can certainly have a multi-host environment where you just have a different host hosting different segments, where you can bring in an occasional, storytelling component without making the whole show about that. Something to think about. Another thing to consider when you're trying to figure out what kind of content you want to produce is what the most popular and most searched for podcast topics are. And here they are: society and culture, business, comedy, news and politics, and of course, health, as many of us like to listen to health podcasts. Do you have to do one of these 5? Definitely not. Everybody has a different idea of what success means for a podcast, and it's important for you and your brand to figure out what success means. Do you want 1 million listeners? Do you want the right 5,000 listeners? Do you not care about listeners at all? Are you just doing a thing that, maybe like a personal podcast that's just fun and exciting for you to do? Depending on your goal, you may want to consider that if you've got a primary or secondary mission that has to do or aligns with one of these things, it may make sense for you to use this as a basis to start searching for the kind of content that you would want to develop. And you can certainly also combine some of these things together. It's not to say you couldn't do a comedy politics podcast. That would certainly probably be pretty exciting and engaging to watch. So when we talk about picking a podcast topic, there are a few things that you need to consider. You need to examine the brand's mission and vision. What are we about? What are we for? What's acceptable for our brand in the eyes of our target demo? What is acceptable for us to talk about? What's something that we can do that's unusual, maybe that they wouldn't expect, but makes sense for the brand, What types of special access do you have available? This is a big one. And this is a thing people forget. People are listening to you. People listen to content. They watch shows because they're getting something out of it. So if you have special access to a person, to a place, to an opportunity, to an event, if there's special access to be had that you can use as part of getting people into the show, you need to use it. So it's a good idea for you to maybe sit down and consider, make a list of the things that you have special access to. And oftentimes the things that we have special access to, we take for granted. So, consider, sitting down, who do I know? Who is somebody that never gives interviews, or somebody that people really want to hear from? And also consider putting the ask out to people you may not know to be interviews, because you never know. It's entirely possible that somebody just hasn't been asked to be on a podcast. And they would do it. So, and finally, you need to consider what you want from your listener, which is a question that people mostly miss. You want to know what your listeners want from you, but you also have to think about what you want back from your listeners. And that could be anything. I mean, it could just be attention. It could be, mailing lists, signups. I don't know what you want, but think about what you want, because that's going to help dictate the kind of content that you're going to be producing. Here's a few tips on things that successful branded podcasts do. They root themselves in the brand mission. They offer some kind of a unique perspective, okay? If you're developing the same content as 1 million other podcasts, why is anybody going to stop to listen to yours? We work with a lot of financial services industries, as I mentioned before. And like I said, many of them, when they call us, start in the same way. I want to do a podcast about how to, get a car loan, get my first auto loan. Great. Who cares? That content is out there a million different ways. And the reality is, if you're doing a financial services podcast, you've got Clark Howard, you've got Susie Orman, you've got Dave Ramsey. These are people who have got major cash to spend developing this kinds of content. And the reality is, you probably agree with 95% of the things they're saying. So to repackage that and put it back out in a regurgitated format doesn't make sense. You have to offer that content in a unique or different perspective. And for many of our clients in particular, the local angle fills that unique perspective, right? Because a national show is not going to take that, whatever the podcast is about, and focus on a hyper-local level. So even just hyper-localizing something can help you offer that unique voice or perspective that you need. Successful branded podcasts also fulfill some sort of a desire of their target audience. This is where that consumer insight component of the PR team or even the social team is going to come in handy. If you're trying to figure out what content to put together, talking to your PR and social teams and saying, like, what are you hearing back from people? Is there a statistic that the PR team maybe knows about your target audience that you're just unaware of that might break all this open for you? You may realize 95% of your audience is also into this other thing that might not have seemed related, but makes sense, right? And finally, successful branded podcasts also provide insight or access, something the consumer couldn't otherwise easily have. But things that they don't do, successful branded podcasts do not directly sell products. If you want to directly sell products, I guess start a YouTube channel or get into broadcast advertising, because that's where people expect that. If they sense that you're directly selling products, and it's not to say 100% of the time, right? If you are, if you're a supplier for, a particular company, and you've got this huge audience of people who are buyers, and you're putting together a specific content for them, yeah, that makes sense for your audience. But we're talking about generalities here, right? In a general audience, perspective, directly selling products doesn't work. You definitely don't want to assume the audience is dumb, and you don't want to have a boring host, because people absolutely tune in for personalities. And one of the biggest questions I get after this presentation is, what do I do if I have a CMO, a VP of marketing, or a CEO who wants to host the podcast? So good luck with that. I don't really have any advice to give you other than hosting a podcast is a very specific skill set. Somebody who's great on camera is not always great in an audio channel, right? Because there's a lot of visual cues. Somebody who looks really great on camera and can deliver a message really poignantly might come across like a total creep on an audio only channel, because you don't have any of the visual elements, which is honestly the majority of the communicating that happens is through visual elements. So there's a lot that has to happen with your voice to carry empathy and nuance. And, not everybody's got that skill set. Some of that is teachable, right? Interview skills are teachable. Hosting skills are trainable, but not always. You can't really get people very far. Like, you can take somebody who doesn't know how to sing at all and teach them how to be like a pretty decent singer. Like, it won't hurt to listen to. But to get them to be Adele, you have to be born with some of it. So it's very similar with hosting and interview skills. Like, you can definitely train, but somebody who's naturally gifted in that area is a much better host than somebody that you have to work up to it. So consider that when you're thinking about who to have host. And in many cases, it may help to record a test episode of several different people hosting and listen back and play it for a focus group and get them to give you some feedback. It's certainly worthwhile when you consider that if people don't like the host, they're not going to listen. Successful branded podcasts can definitely take a stand on some kind of an issue, especially if it speaks to your brand mission. It makes total sense. It's a no-brainer. You can definitely get in the weeds. You can go deeper. You can explain things, because, you got to consider people are searching for this content. Odds are they're smarter than the average when it comes to this specific topic. So you can definitely go a little deeper, particularly as your show gets into subsequent seasons, season 2, season 3. These people have listened to your content. You don't always want to start at a 101 level. You're going to burn the audience. They're going to get tired of, they're going to feel like you're patronizing them. So, get to a point where you are speaking about things at a higher level and people will appreciate it. Especially, if they discover you in season 3, they can always go back to listen to season 1 and 2, right? So there's definitely like opportunity for them to learn. Successful branded podcasts, however, cannot be inconsistent in terms of their tone, their messaging, content, delivery, and that delivery is a big one. If you promise people a monthly episode, you got to deliver a monthly episode. So think about that when you're putting together content. We highly recommend that people put together content in seasons, right? So you're developing a full season of a show, and then you're either dropping it Netflix style all at once, or you're setting it and forgetting it. You're putting it all out throughout the year, and it's just automatically happening. This is the kind of thing that an advanced production will do, and that I would highly encourage you to do as well. Because if you're not putting out content in the way that you're telling people you're going to, they're going to stop listening. They're just, it's not going to be perceived as a professional production. But you can certainly get it done. It's the way that we recommend it. We don't recommend coming out and flatly saying, we're going to have a monthly show or a weekly show. We typically will recommend seasonality. Hey, we're going to put out 13 episodes this season, and then, reference it throughout the show. At the last episode, make sure like, hey, this wraps up this season of the show. We're going to be putting together new content and coming back out, whatever, next year. That gives people, a cue of what to expect, and it's important. You definitely cannot be unoriginal, cannot deliver the same content as others. We talked about that. You cannot have low production quality. But again, you're hearing that from the audio producer. So I would highly recommend you keep that content high quality as a good reflection of your brand. So let's talk about the production process. And I know I'm kind of getting close on time. I promise we're getting close to the end, but hopefully you guys are getting a lot of good info out of this. I will tell you, there are 5 phases to the production process that I'm going to cover here. There's a lot of info. I'm going to share with you the PDF, the PDF of the slides. So don't feel like you need to write all this down. Just kind of listen along and you'll get the gist of it. So the 5 phases of production are as follows. Pre-season production. It's probably where most of you are now. You have an idea for a show, so you're kind of maybe fleshing out like some high level macro ideas about, titles, URLs. What are we talking about large, in broad perspectives? Why do people care? Who's our audience? You might be doing a full season outline, like, okay, let's break down what each individual episode is going to be about loosely, stuff like that, right? Then you go into phase 2, and this is where the money is earned. Phase 2 is the most complex part of the entire production. It's your pre-episode production. This is where you've got your producers, where you've got to have a producer, somebody leading this charge. It's topic research and selection. It's locating, contacting, finding people to interview. It's figuring out who your hosts are. It's doing pre-interviews with all your guests. It's assembling pre-production packages. It's licensing all the materials that you need to license to get things done legally and correctly. It's, sourcing audio. You do this right, and everything else is a million times easier. This is that joke of producers of like, we'll fix it in post. It's real, okay? You don't want to get to post and have to still be figuring some of this stuff out. This is all stuff you do ahead of time, right? So now phase 2 is done. Phase 3 is the recording phase. So if phase 2 went well and you did everything right, this is so much easier. It's the phase where everybody's going to want to be involved. Everybody's going to want to be in the studio and do the cool stuff, take selfies and whatever. But you're coordinating your guests. You're doing your tech company, whoever's producing your podcast for you is figuring out the tech and getting everybody together. And it's super fun. And you record all this audio. And then you get to phase 4 and you wonder why you recorded so much stinking audio, because you've got a 15-minute podcast and now you've got 3 hours of recording. And that sounds like an exaggeration, but like I'm working on a new series right now for a big company. That's a 45-minute podcast. And we no lie recorded 7 hours of content for a 45-minute podcast. So the edit has been phenomenal. It's been a real blast. But in this post-production phase, this is where your producer from phase 2 comes around and helps you build the story with your editor. So your editor and your producers are working together to say, okay, how are we telling the story? What's interesting? What are we leaving out? What is the order of the story, right? So hopefully you did a lot of that work in phase 2, and now phase 4 is you're putting the pieces together. You're doing corrections and pickups, and you're getting it placed on the platforms. Then we'll talk about platforms here in just a sec. And then phase 5 is your post-show launch. So the show's out. Hopefully you've set it up to release automatically. And now your social team is, making sure that they're promoting episodes, making sure they're back promoting, making sure your PR team is putting out press releases, making sure your blog is corresponding to what's happening on your podcast, making sure that, your guests are aware of when episodes are going live so that they can share with their audiences links to listen to the episode, all these sorts of like little post-launchy things that have to be coordinated. And then it's review how it went. So, at the end of all this at phase 5 is how'd it go? What did we like? What didn't we like? What changes do we want to make to season 2? And then you go right back to phase 1 of looking at the sort of macro level, right? So that's your 5-phase production, basically in a nutshell. Well, let's talk about platforms and promotion. There are a number of platforms, right? Apple's podcast platform was king for a very long time. It still kind of is king. Stitcher and SoundCloud were around for a long time as part of, the Android marketplace. There are a huge number of platforms coming out lately. It's very similar to digital streaming platforms for TV shows, but Pandora's got a platform, iHeartMedia's got a platform, Spotify's got a platform. Everybody's rolling out a platform. So you don't have to be, a single-minded. You don't have to only pick one. You can literally be on everything. So keep that in mind. It's more work, but it can be done. In terms of the metrics and the money and how you can track what's happening, you want to set up a promotional plan. And this is early on in this process. You want to work with the PR team to figure out how you're going to post-promote this show, because creating content and just putting it out there, as many of you are probably aware, is simply not enough. You have to be able to have a PR plan that you promote, that you work. You want to consider social channels. You want to consider potentially purchasing ads in other podcasts with similar audiences. You want to consider things that you're going to have to do in the recording process that you may need later. Filming some of it is a great idea. Getting photos, getting quotes from your guests, making sure that you've got all the social content you're going to need as you're doing the job, right? You're going to want to set up your RSS feed, which an RSS feed is very simply when you get a subscriber, like we talked about, that subscriber gets a notice that there's a new episode. So that's what an RSS feed does. It pushes to everybody's devices that there is a new episode available for download. So you want to set that up. It's relatively simple. And you want to push your blog readers into listening to more about a topic. You want to make sure basically that you're cross-promoting on every available channel. Downloads versus subscribers we talked about earlier. We want to make sure that we're determining what success is for our brands like we talked about earlier. And remember that developing evergreen content helps increase your listenership for each episode, because as people discover you later down the line, they come back to the beginning and they're able to listen to more. So that's going to increase the number of downloads in your earlier episodes as well. If you want to track your listeners, we highly recommend PodTrack is one of the platforms. There's a bunch of platforms, but PodTrack is one. It's pretty good. You might want to take a look at that. In terms of the ads, if you want to sell space on a podcast, you can do that through AdvertiseCast. It's a sign-up service. It's relatively easy. You get in there, you say, hey, I do a podcast about fishing. And then like a company that sells fishing lures might contact you and offer you $10 to run an ad. Who knows? But you can do that through there. And then if you're a media buyer on this call, if you're thinking about running advertising, you may want to consider a platform called Midroll. This is by invite only. This is the big time players. So the Conan O'Briens, the Dr. Phil's, the Oprahs, blah, blah, blah. They are represented by companies like Midroll. So you can go in there and you can place national media buys. That is a little bit more of a rigid structure for sure. The ad types that you can expect to see in podcasts are the ad types that you could expect to see in any sort of digital streaming service: pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll. Your live reads are your gold standards. That's where you have the host do something interactive about, so they're actually doing a live read. Just like with morning radio, that's the gold standard because people have a relationship with the host and it's essentially a personal endorsement. Recorded reads are also typically done by the hosts. A couple of final quick tips. You want to put together a dynamic team on air. You don't want to rely on a single person. That's putting too much of the burden on one particular person, and we highly recommend you break out of that early on if possible. Consider different segment hosts. Consider just some different ways that you can break it up. Create segments that involve your listeners. This is a really easy thing to do to get people to buy into the show more. That could easily be a call-in segment. That could be having a listener on the show at a particular point in time. That could be taking questions from the audience. That could be, interacting with them through social media platforms and, through a poll and talking about that poll on the air. Interact with them. Find a way to get people engaged. It's important to get people involved. Look for guests that already have following in your target demo. I probably didn't have to tell you this, but it certainly helps grow an audience if you have guests that have similar audiences to you. Invest in production quality, again, says the audio producer. So, spending a little bit of money will go a long way to making your listeners keep listening. And finally, be consistent. Make sure you're creating that content ahead of schedule, and do what you say you're going to do in terms of delivering content to the audience. So thank you all very much. I will take questions. I know it's close to the top of the hour, and I'm sorry if I went a little bit over time, but I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer and take questions if you guys have some.
Great, thank you so much. Go ahead, Daryl.
We have a first question from Ann Woodward. If we don't have the resources to invest in equipment, could we hire agencies such as Push Button to help record, set up monthly podcasts?
Yeah, exactly. That's literally, and I just, I'm not I don't like to sales pitch during presentations because I know that that's not why you guys come to learn. But yes, and I will be happy to talk to you offline about that. Who was that?
That was coming from Ann Woodward.
Ann Woodward. I will put here in the chat box my email address. If you would like to reach out to me, I would be more than happy to explain to you how that process works. One thing I will say is that given the pandemic, studios are closed. Many of the ways, typically when we would record for a brand, the way we do it is we would pre-produce and we'd fly out to wherever we were going to go and we build a studio there. And then we record all the content in a week or however long, and then we come back and we finish the production here. That is obviously changing. We've got these virtual kits that we are now sending out. The pandemic forced us into figuring out this technology, which is really, really cool, and might actually change the way we do things going forward. But it's all done 100% virtually and will be probably for the remainder of the year. But yes, happy to talk to you about that offline if you want to send me something later.
Anybody else have anything for Yeosh?
Wait, you have a layered pixie, Ann? I kind of want to see what this looks like. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chats now. I wasn't able to see them during the presentation. Oh, cool.
A few people posted some things to check out.
Yeah, that's great. You know what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to make a PDF of this presentation file and load it. I think I can actually load it into the chat, right?
Thank you very much, Yeosh.
Yeah, is that doable? If not, who should I email it to?
Yep, it is doable. There's a file button there. I believe you can upload it there, but you can also send it to Terry earlier and I'll get it out to everyone. So whichever you prefer.
I will do both. How about that?
Okay.
Just in case somebody wants to.
I have another question for you that came in.
Sure, what's that?
You said you did podcasts for financial institutions. Mm-hmm. What do you cover in those?
So, all right, we've got a financial institution that's based in Montana. And they came to us with a very similar ask, like many people would do. And they said, listen, we want to do a financial services podcast. And we said, no. And so we said, listen, let's look at what's going on in your landscape. And it's a client that we had been working with for several years at this point. And so what we did was we looked at their media market and we said, okay, you're in an in-between media market. You've got television stations in surrounding markets, but nothing within your market, right? So I think we all kind of know that sort of a market, right? Where they're not quite big enough to have their own television news station, but they're getting in stuff like that, right? They also had their radio stations were kind of underfunded. So they didn't have very robust news teams. The newspapers, when we looked at them, had okay circulation, but ultimately what we figured out was for this particular financial institution, it was more about the community part of their message. It was like, who's telling the stories about the people and places in this community? And, the way we pitched it was like, look, your job at this particular credit union is community focused. The name of the community is in the name of the credit union. And there is a lack of good quality content speaking about things that are happening right around you. And if you identify that as a substantial enough need, isn't it worth the credit union's time and resources to create that podcast that is essentially a community-based podcast that tells stories about the Native American tribes that are in the area, that talks about the Olympians who train here year-round, that things that are nobody's covering, and it fulfills that community part of the mission. And we even went so far as to not brand it it is essentially, it's going to have its own title. The podcast itself, it will have a separate title brought to you by the credit union. So people will be aware that the credit union is developing the content, but the point of it isn't to create something that's focused entirely on financial services. The point of it was to do something that was good for the community. Again, this is why podcasting really lives in the PR vertical, because you're doing something for the good of the mission that you're trying to accomplish. So hopefully that answered that question thoroughly.
Great answer.
Okay, cool.
We did have one that said, do you have any nonprofit clients who host podcasts? If so, what kind of content do they share?
Non-profit specifically, nothing is really coming to mind in terms of my clients that are nonprofit focused. We develop obviously content for like AAF things, but I don't know that I would call AAF a pure like nonprofit, if that makes sense. Just
yeah,
that's tough.
I actually have a nonprofit client as well, and the person who asked the question works for a nonprofit.
Yeah, I get it.
Both of our clients actually have, great individual personal stories.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be of interest, or are there certain legalities to that?
Well, you're gonna want releases from everybody if they do that. But start with the mission in mind, right? So like, what do you want out of this? Is this a fundraising podcast? Is this an awareness raising podcast? What are you trying to do? And let that sort of guide, like work backwards from that to figure out where your content is going to live. Because if you're trying to fundraise, that's a very different message, in my opinion, from just raising awareness about an issue, right? And are you raising awareness about the issue, or are you raising awareness about the organization, right? Because if you're raising awareness about the organization, it might make more sense to focus on the people involved within the organization. If you're raising awareness about the issue, it makes more sense for you to look at the people who are affected by the issue. If you're looking to fundraise, there may be an entirely different avenue that you might want to go down. But you have to kind of start with what do you want out of this, right? There has to be a reason you're doing this other than the novelty of doing a podcast. Because if that's all you're doing it for, you probably won't get more than a few episodes in before burnout,
Great answer. I mean, that goes right through your process. So that's excellent. I see that you shared your PDF in chat for anybody who's interested in downloading that.
Yep.
Thank you for that. Yeosh, thank you for joining us today. Great information, great insight. And we thank you, and hopefully we'll hear more from you in the future.
All right. Thank you, guys.
This is Daryl Anderson. I'm with Clark Creative and am AAF Omaha's first vice president. I've had the opportunity to work with the program team to bring our members excellent professional development programming like this throughout the year. And as David mentioned earlier, we'll continue to offer virtual activities for members until we can start meeting in person for our events. A couple of things on the calendar that I'm going to go over really quick. Next week starts next week, the American Advertising Federation has taken the Federation's annual conference, Admerica, online, offering many opportunities and programs for our members to take advantage of the next week and throughout June. Visit AAF.org for a complete list of upcoming Admerica events to participate in from office or home. Here's one of the highlights. June 8th at 1 p.m. Central Time, AAF is hosting Transparency Builds Trust inaugural symposium. It's a discussion of how and why we must build trust and transparency with our consumers and business partners. It is critical in the competitive digital marketplace where consumers expect to be treated truthfully and fairly and have the online power to respond positively and negatively. The ethical and legal cases for building trust throughout transparency merge and are both essential. The symposium will begin with a data and ethics roundtable with executives from MasterCard, Omnicom, Microsoft, the American Advertising Federation, and the government officials. It's going to be followed by specialized leadership conversations with leaders from CNBC, Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, the Fund, the American Bar Association, Davis and Gilbert, the World Economic Forum, and Media Post, plus more. I'd like to highlight that the AAF American Advertising Awards will be hosted June 26th. Registration details for the national event at AAF.org. The opportunity to attend the National Addies this year is a treat for us all to join virtually, so we urge you to check that out. Coming up locally, our new social group Ad Reads, the virtual book club and happy hour where we talk about books about advertising via Zoom. The second session is scheduled for July 30th, 5 to 5:45, moderated by David Moore and Aubrey Schreier, who can resist a book so perfectly on the theme from this year's AAF Nebraska Addy Awards. So join your fellow ad pros to discuss creative blindness and how to cure it, written by Dave Trott. Founder of the 4 award-winning agencies, Dave is a master of persuasion and strategy. You can get the book on Amazon Kindle for $10. Watch your inbox for upcoming educational programs and webinars that we're going to offer throughout the summer. We ask you to reach out to us and let us know how we can help you in any way. We know more than ever that this can be challenging times, so we're opening more of our benefits to everybody in the community. We're providing free resume posting, resume and portfolio reviews for students and members, and we'll continue to provide free professional development opportunities through webinars the next several months. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you, Josh. Yash.
Yeah, man.
Have a great day.
A real pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much. You spent the whole day with AAF today.
You don't even know the half of it. It doesn't even stop here. I'm going on to it. See you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.